Hey everybody, this is section 3 of chapter 2 of part 2 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR. Third period, 1930 to 1941, Part 1, The Dominated. Part 2 of the book is titled The Militarized Working Class. Chapter 2 of Part 2 is titled Extension of the Wage-Earning Class and the Rigidifying of Factory Despotism. The third section of this chapter, which is the chapter being 100 pages long, is titled The Transformation of the Conditions of the Workers' Struggle and the Veritable, quote, nationalization, end quote, of the trade unions. So there we go. For a proper understanding of the way in which the conditions of the workers' struggle changed in the 1930s, a brief recapitulation is necessary. As is well known, in the period of, quote, war communism, end quote, there was a strong tendency towards, quote, nationalization, end quote, of the trade unions. That is their complete subordination to the state apparatus, so the trade unions could participate to the fullest extent in the struggle for output. One moment. Come on, you son of a bitch. Sorry, I have to get to the end notes. I lost my spot. Okay, there we are. And all it says is this footnote is see volume 1 of this work. Okay, end footnote. At the end of 1920, Lenin condemned this tendency. Lenin affirmed the dual nature of the Soviet state and indicated that this required that the unions were sufficiently independent to enable the workers to, quote, protect themselves, end quote, against their state, end quote. Lenin. A little later, Lenin opposed Trotsky and Bukharin, who, in the name of a, quote, production takeoff, end quote, had reproached him for preoccupying himself with, quote, formal democracy, end quote. Replying to these criticisms, Lenin recalled that it was necessary to allow the unions to defend the workers so that the workers could fulfill their production tasks. In March 1921, the 10th Congress of the party adopted, by a substantial majority, resolutions in line with this position. The latter was confirmed in January 1922 when the Central Committee voted for a resolution formulated by Lenin that emphasized that there existed necessarily, quote, a certain conflict of interest in matters concerning labor conditions between the masses of workers and the directors and managers of the state enterprises or the government departments in charge of them, end quote. Hence, even in state enterprises, it was, quote, undoubtedly the duty of the trade unions to protect the interest of the working people, end quote. In reality, this position and the consequences that flowed from it were only partially accepted by some party cadres and enterprise managers. Realizing the social tension that this situation engendered, the Fourth Congress in December 1925 reaffirmed that the main task of the unions was the defense of the economic interests of the masses. Simultaneously, there was condemnation of the tendency to form a, quote, unnatural block, end quote, between the economic and union organs. It was emphasized that this tendency weakened trade union discipline. Nevertheless, this tendency remained at work despite the position of principle that had been adopted. At the time the industrialization policy was launched, these positions of principle were themselves abandoned, which was not without practical consequences. The change of direction at that time explicitly obliged unions to give priority to output and compelled them to get rid of most of the old union leaders, notably Tomsky, replaced by Zvernik, This riddance was entirely carried out, quote, from above, end quote, by decisions that the party imposed on the unions. The decisions taken then tolled the bell for the new economic policy attempt to leave a certain initiative to the union cadres. Henceforth, the latter had above all to obey the central organs of the party. They had to conform with the orders that they received from the party, in particular those involving production tasks, productivity increases, and labor discipline. New section, Section A. The 16th Congress, June-July 1930, the role of the trade unions in the struggle for industrialization. The 16th Congress confirmed the large-scale elimination carried out from above of the great majority of the old union leaders. In uncompromising language typical of the man, Lazar Kaganovich declared that to the Congress that, quote, the great majority of the leadership of the Central Council of the trade unions and of the separate unions have been replaced. Some might say that this is a violation of proletarian democracy, but comrades, it has long been known that for us, Bolsheviks, democracy is not a fetish, end quote. Lazar Kaganovich. Interesting enough, Lazar Kaganovich, who was an ardent Stalinist and defended Stalin's legacy, well after de-Stalinization, I think until his death. He was alive for both. He was a Bolshevik, I'm pretty sure. In 1917, and died after 1991. So he saw the entire duration of the Soviet Union during his lifetime, which I think is a crazy thing to think about. This formulation by Kaganovich is explained by the fact that the, quote, purge, end quote, of the unions is not carried out by the unions themselves, but entrusted to the party-controlled commission and to the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate, RKI, quote, at the request of the Central Council of Trade Unions, end quote, as it was expressed in the, quote, Union Resolution, end quote, passed by the 16th Congress. This resolution accused the old leadership of having followed a, quote, opportunist and trade unionist, end quote, orientation that was incompatible with the requirements of the, quote, Reconstruction period, end quote. The resolution affirmed the need to continue the struggle against such an orientation. The resolution called on party organizations to ensure a, quote, concrete direction, end quote, for trade union activity. The last formulation broke with the position expressed in the previous principle, which demanded that the party should exercise a, quote, general direction, end quote, avoiding what Lenin termed, quote, paltry bureaucratism, end quote, and, quote, troublemaking interference in the unions, end quote. Lenin. In sum, the, quote, Union Resolution aimed at making the unions into instruments for carrying out the plans. The central paragraph of the text is titled, quote, Getting Down to Production, end quote. It detailed the union's task in this field. It insisted on the organization of socialist competition and the role of shock brigade workers, Udarniki. Wikipedia says, in the terminology of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and other communist countries, an udarnik, also known in English as a shock worker or strike worker, collectively known as shock brigades or shock labor team, is a high productivity worker. It derived from the expression, quote, udarni trud, end quote, for, quote, super productive, enthusiastic labor, end quote. Back to the text. Paragraphs devoted to improvement of workers' material living conditions and to, quote, cultural and political work, end quote, occupied only a secondary place. It is clear that union activity in these fields was regarded as simply a means of raising production. All this was in accordance with the demands emanating from industry and the economic administrations. At the beginning of 1931, the VSNKH newspaper suggested that the unions should be split up so that the unions would be in, quote, harmony, end quote, with the organization of the main industries, so that the unions would, quote, really have their eyes fixed on output, end quote, and could succeed in establishing counter norms, parenthesis, norms higher than those in force, end parenthesis. On January 17th, the newspaper of the Central Council of Trade Unions, parenthesis, TRUDE, end parenthesis, declared that a special committee of the Central Council had arrived at the conclusion that it was necessary to split up the unions. At the end of January 1931, after a report presented by Schwernick, the Central Council adopted a decision which increased the number of union federations from 22 to 44, without even having consulted them. After this reorganization, the powers of the plenary assembly of the Central Council were reduced in favor of the presidium of this council. The presidium was itself put under the direct control of the party Politburo. The whole trade union reorganization was carried out from above. It also led to a financial centralization. Henceforth, all the union funds were in the hands of the Central Council, which was required to distribute them between the different union organizations. In fact, after the end of 1929 and again after the 16th Congress, the unions concentrated their attention on production growth, on, quote, socialist competition, end quote, and on the raising of norms. The unions went so far as denouncing workers who tried to oppose these increases. The trade union presses commonly describe such workers as, quote, self-seekers, end quote, and sometimes publish their names with a recommendation to enterprises not to hire them. The desire to achieve at any price production plans that were extremely ambitious, parenthesis, and partly unfulfillable, end parenthesis, and to increase the profits of state enterprises so as to provide finance for a very heavy investment program, led the party, especially in spring 1931, to demand that the unions conduct a campaign for an increase of work norms and for wage limitation. In taking this path, the unions were led to denounce workers as well as factory managers, opposed to increased work norms, and this increase usually led to a wage reduction, to the deterioration of the working conditions, and even to the decline of output quality. To the decline of output quality. Such practices and the total indifference of the unions to the living conditions of the workers ruined the union's prestige and authority among workers. If the workers remained unionized, it was essentially because of the pressure put on the unions. Put on the workers, and also so as to benefit from the material advantages obtained by possession of a union card. Finally, these union practices damaged production itself, so that in June 1931, Stalin had to give a reminder that the improvement of working and living conditions of workers was essential for the growth of output. Footnote. Stalin's speech of June 23, 1931 was called New Conditions, New Tasks in Economic Construction. End footnote. This reminder gave rise to numerous union, quote, self-criticisms, end quote. For example, in a declaration made at the time of the August meeting of the Presidium of the Central Council of Trade Unions, Trude wrote, quote, the trade union leaders had come to regard it as bad taste and perhaps even opportunistic to concern themselves with the vital needs of the workers. In the tractor plants, the union organizations have become malignant growths of the managements and have their trade union character. The next day, the same paper returned to the same question. Many important organizations misunderstood the political importance of the struggle for the systematic improvement of the workers' living conditions, insofar as it influences the success of socialist construction. Many union organizations misunderstand the political importance of the struggle for the systematic improvement of the workers' living conditions, insofar as it influences the success of socialist construction. This misunderstanding is at the bottom of the characteristic attitude that many worker organizations adopt, showing lack of interest in many horrifying facts that have so disastrous a repercussion on the execution of the industrial and financial plan. End quote. Excuse me. Trude, August 15th and 16th, 1931. These, quote, self-criticisms, end quote, although inspired by anxieties about output, had no effects. The immediate primacy of output led the unions to worry more about that than about working conditions. They accepted their subordination to the central economic organs. The unions changed themselves into appendages of these and even condemned factory managers who granted, quote, unjustified, end quote, wage increases. At the beginning of 1932, Trude stigmatized local unions, which behaved differently, writing of their, quote, complicity with enterprise managements who, quote, have taken the road of unjustified wage increases, end quote. In February 1932, the Federation of Engineering Construction Workers attacked factory managers who allowed wage increases when the production plan had not been fulfilled. It went as far as requesting the procuracy to bring criminal proceedings against these managers. The, quote, vigilance, end quote, of the unions with regard to, quote, excessiveness of wages, end quote, was all the greater since they themselves were also held responsible for these excesses. They thereby became a state organ with the, quote, policing of wages, end quote. In 1932, as the end of the first 5-year plan approached, the race for output growth accelerated and led more than ever to unions being regarded as organs charged above all with the fulfillment of the plan, including the financial plan. They were very frequently opposing wage increases, which would have reduced enterprises' profit margins. As will be seen, this contributed to a reduction of real wages, whilst the first 5-year plan had provided for an increase. I'm going to repeat these last two sentences. The unions were very frequently opposing wage increases which would have reduced enterprises' profit margins. As will be seen, this contributed to a reduction of real wages whilst the 5-year plan had provided for an increase. New section, Section B. The Ninth Trade Union Congress, April 1932, and the, quote, takeover, end quote, of the unions by the state. The Ninth Congress of Trade Unions met in April 1932 in a fully, quote, productivist, end quote, atmosphere. Here Kaganovich once more condemned the former union leadership, eliminated 3 years previously, criticizing its, quote, Menshevik Trotskyist, end quote, attitude that, quote, put the workers' interest against those of socialist industry, end quote. Zvernik insisted on the tasks that the unions had to carry out resolutely, notably the greatest possible extension of piecework with wage rates based on technical norms. In total, the reports presented to the Congress emphasized that the unions were to, quote, devote themselves to the mobilization of all working-class strength for the expansion of socialist construction at an accelerated rhythm, end quote. Ninth Congress of Trade Unions. And that the unions were not to sacrifice this activity for the sake of, quote, protective, end quote, tasks, according to the formulation used to condemn the activity of Mikhail Tomsky and other former union leaders. It just says Tomsky, but I think it's Mikhail Tomsky. The Union line fixed by the Ninth Congress of Trade Unions a line which carried further previous practices, confirmed that Soviet workers were by this time deprived of any organization that could help them to struggle at the workplace for their interests and their working conditions. This is a great historical repression which helped to destroy the working class as a self-conscious class. This was a great historical repression which helped to destroy the working class as a self-conscious class. This led to serious consequences for the workers and even for output itself, so much so that it inevitably produced a crisis that took the form of a, quote, trade union crisis, end quote. This crisis was such that 16 years were to elapse before the 10th Trade Union Congress met, in 1949, in parentheses. The Congress, moreover, did not change anything fundamental in the role of the unions as auxiliaries of enterprise managements and of the government. Footnote, the Ninth Congress still included 84.9% of delegates regarded as, quote, workers. At the 10th Congress, later constituted only 23.5%, while 43% were union officials and 9.4% technicians. See Isaac Deutscher, Soviet Trade Unions, 1950. End footnote. Footnote. As is known, the same situation still prevails today in the USSR as in the Soviet bloc countries and also in other, quote, socialist countries, end quote. The only exception is Poland, where the workers' struggles enabled the workers to again form a union organization that would not simply be an instrument used by the exploiting class and its power. End footnote. However, at the beginning of the 1930s, the pressure put on the unions by the party and government and the purges which struck trade unionists considered as, quote, opportunists, end quote, did not succeed in preventing militant unionists, especially those of them who were close to the worker grassroots, from trying to resist the application of the, quote, productivist line, end quote. An echo of this resistance may be found in various statements by the leaders of the Central Union apparat. For example, in 1933, Gavril Weinberg stated, quote, we must fight the bad trade unionists who distort the party line with the same severity as the party itself brings to bear against its opportunists. ... In the union ranks, one sometimes hears remarks like this, quote, is it right for unions to impose improvements of wages granted by industrial managers? If we do so, how will we look to the workers? End quote. This is to seriously misunderstand the duties of the unions. This is pure trade unionism, ... This kind of, quote, defense of the workers' interest, end quote, must be fought mercilessly. Gavril Weinberg. One second. Okay, moving on. I was trying to find something for Gavril Weinberg, but I couldn't really find anything. Sanctions, quote, against bad trade unionists, end quote, were not without effect. Enterprise managers summoned by the central departments to increase work norms increased them substantially. The discontent of the working class then often made itself felt, a circumstance that the central organ of the unions vigorously condemned, writing, for example, quote, the revision of norms has collided with a substantial resistance from elements of the hostile classes, self-seekers, and idlers. Bracket, It is workers whose living standards have substantially declined who are described in these terms. Charles Bettelheim, end bracket. Numerous reports have had to be made about attacks by class enemies having the aim of preventing the execution of the labor productivity plan. These attacks are various. Sometimes they are threats against employees of the norm-fixing offices, sometimes a skillful depression of productivity, sabotage of time-checking, agitation against norm revision, or attempts to organize the resistance of certain groups of workers, end quote. Trude, April 6, 1933. There could hardly be a better admission of the existence of a movement outside the union organizations, of a struggle by workers against the degradation of their living and working conditions. The counterstroke to this article was the literal, quote, nationalization, end quote, of the unions. This state takeover took the form of its opposite. The dissolution of the Labor Commissariat and the attribution of the Labor Commissariat's functions to the unions, which became a virtual state administration. For example, the management of Social Security and the checking of the observation of safety measures at work were transferred to the Central Council of Trade Unions. In 1934, the unions were in addition entrusted with the functions of workers' and peasants' inspection at the factory level, and they had to verify the application of party and government directives concerning production and wages. The unions became an enormous apparatus entrusted with many functions. In fact, the unions were transformed into an administration directly subject to the instructions of the Politburo and Sovnarkom. This transformation, however, conferred on them a new, quote, authority, end quote, in relation to the workers, especially insofar as they managed Social Security and the application of labor legislation. The scale of the union apparatus was then such that a reorganization became necessary. A decision taken in September 1934 by the Party Central Committee, then ratified by the Central Council of Trade Unions, led to a new burst of union federations. At the end of this reorganization, there were 154 federations, in place of 44 in 1931, later this total would reach 170. Clearly, this reorganization did not change the effects of the, quote, productivist, end quote, line. The latter went so far as that it worried even the industrial managers because lack of attention to working conditions and the resulting discontent had negative repercussions on production. Thus, at the time of a conference of managers of heavy industry, there was a new reproach leveled at the unions for not paying enough attention to the workers' living conditions. In this way, what would be called the, quote, union crisis, end quote, signaled its approach. New section, Section C, the, quote, trade union crisis, end quote, and its aftermath. At the beginning of 1935, the disaffection and discontent of workers in regard to, quote, their, end quote, trade unions became increasingly evident. The elections to the enterprise union committees took place in an atmosphere of deep indifference, with a very low turnout. The situation worried the party leadership. It made it appear that there was a growing rift between the workers and the state apparatus. In addition, this situation meant that the unions were not capable of coping with tasks that had to be correctly performed in order to prevent the existing contradictions in industrial enterprises deepening to the point where they could seriously hamper production. On May 26, Stalin called a meeting of the Central Council leaders. Stalin placed before them several questions about the confusion in which the elections to enterprise committees had been carried out, the ignorance of these elections, which the masses had shown, the lack of, quote, real democracy, end quote, which characterized them, and the, quote, bad work, end quote, of the unions. Stalin suggested breaking off the elections and preparing new elections to take place in different Excuse me. I pressed the button. Stalin suggested breaking off the elections and preparing new elections to take place in different conditions after the unions had ordered a new program containing, quote, new tasks, end quote. Stalin declared that, quote, the average worker sometimes asks, quote, do we really need trade unions, end quote, end quote. Stalin reproached the latter of useless repetition with the economic organs and enterprise managements, quote, when the essential task of the unions should be to concentrate all their attention on the cultural and daily needs of the masses, end quote. Stalin, Pravda, December 11th, 1935. According to the account of this conversation, which was published, but only almost 7 months later, and which indicated the existence of serious resistance by numerous cadres to the guidelines then sketched, Stalin also declared, quote, caring about the human personality, housing, culture, the daily needs of the working class, that is where trade union preoccupation should be centered, end quote. Stalin. In the task thereby assigned to the unions, it was no longer a matter of directing efforts above all to production, but rather toward, quote, the cultural and daily needs of the masses, end quote. Nor was there further mention of the role of the unions in the determination of working conditions and production. These declarations opened what would be called the, quote, trade union crisis, end quote, and some seem to mark a turning point. So I was trying to see if there was anything on the internet for trade union crisis, but I didn't see anything. These declarations opened what would be called the, quote, trade union crisis, end quote, and seemed to mark a turning point. In reality, the subsequent course of events showed that there was not a turning point, but only phrases, and when some measures intended to transform part of the union cadres, who were applying the party line, into, quote, scapegoats, end quote, offered up as expiatory victims to the discontent of the workers. What actually happened was that following this conversation of May 26, 1935, the Party Central Committee appointed a committee chaired by L. Kaganovich, entrusted with the reorganization of union activities. This committee operated for several months without the trade unions being publicly informed. This committee's first decision was to suspend the elections. In November, this committee invited the Central Council of Trade Unions to call a conference in which would take part the Central Councils of the Union Federations. The 5 Central Secretaries then publicly condemned the situation and openly admitted that there was a, quote, union crisis, end quote. In the record of the conference can be read, quote, trade unions are passing through a crisis. Numerous trade union members expressed the justified discontent these trade union members feel about union activity. These trade union members ask what is their use, and how can they serve the proletarian state and the working masses? It is necessary on the part of unionized workers and employees to interpose self-criticism of the most severe and pitiless type. A radical and decisive turning point in union activities, ... Scope for initiative from below must be allowed, for only the working masses will succeed in bringing union activities to the necessary level, end quote. It was here that the pursuit of scapegoats began. The conference was followed by a wave of self-criticisms by union officials. However, this wave was not long in subsiding. During December, talk of a, quote, union crisis, end quote, diminished. There was only mention of a, quote, certain union crisis, end quote. In January 1936, the self-criticism ceased. In fact, relationships between the union organizations and the workers deteriorated to such an extent that the existence of anything that could be called, quote, union life, end quote, was impossible. In any case, during 1936, trade union problems retreated into the background. At that time, there was beginning a period of acute social and political conflict within the dominant class itself. All the attention of the party was reserved for the, quote, great trials, end quote, and vast repressive operations. True, the problems that the trade unions should have tackled continued to demand solutions. Echoes of this can be found in the central and regional press. For example, the Robochi Put, parenthesis, the Workers' Path, in parenthesis, the newspaper of the Smolensk Party Regional Committee. Specifically, the party archive of this region, available in the USA, contains correspondence which is very interesting for the light it throws on the nature of the problems posed by the workers in 1936. Thus, one finds in this correspondence letters addressed to the Regional Party Committee Secretary Romantsev by the workers of a factory of the region, parenthesis, a factory to which, moreover, had been given the name of this party cadre, in parenthesis. In these letters, the signatories denounced excessively high norms, inadequate wages, deplorable housing conditions, and condemned the indifference of the union representatives. For example, the workers of Workshop Number 2 of the Romantsev factory wrote, quote, "We have a great request. If you do not intercede, we will all leave work. It is impossible to work further, ... We do not earn anything, since the leaders are concerned only with themselves, and they receive salaries and give themselves premiums. Metalkova ... takes their side. For them, there are spas, rest homes, and sanatoria, and there is nothing for the workers," end quote. In the correspondence received by Romantsev can also be found a letter sent to him by Metalkova. The latter defends herself against accusations made against her, including accusations in letters sent to Robochi Put. Taking up some of these charges, Metalkova claims that she has no means of coping with the demands addressed to the union, especially the ones concerning the housing problem. Thus she writes, quote, "It is not possible to repair the quarters of the worker, Safronova, since the worker lives in a place suitable for hay and the place is rotting. The whole roof fell in, and all the timbers are rotting, ... We beg the proper organization to give her an apartment, ... I turned to the city Soviet. Comrade Plyusinin answered that there were no rooms, ... There must be many dissatisfied people among us at the factory, since we investigated 843 workers' quarters and discovered that we have 143 workers who need quarters, who live under very bad conditions, and that 205 apartments need repairs, ... These people came to the factory committee, beg for repairs for apartments, and I have to refuse them. They in turn tell me that they will write to Robochi Put. Will write to you. ... end quote. Medalova, I guess is the trade union head in this particular region. I don't know. What the result of this correspondence was is unknown, but it shows the exasperation of certain workers towards their union representatives. Some months later, the quote purges, in quote, parenthesis, obviously intended to moderate this exasperation, in parenthesis, struck a large part of the party and union cages in Smolensk as elsewhere. Evident this was not enough to solve the difficulties with which the workers are struggling, nor to establish relationships of trust between them and their union organizations. In fact, despite the purges, the discontent of workers in regard to their union organization deepened. At the beginning of 1937, the party again attacked, quote, scapegoats, end quote. This time it was the union representatives at the regional level who were accused. The first accusations were made in March 1937 against the Union Council of Leningrad Region. For example, the secretary of the Regional Party Committee declared, quote, "The activity of the Regional Union Council is completely rotten. One cannot see any sign of democracy in it, ... In many meetings of the Presidium, the statutory quorum was not reached, and there have been many cases where Comrade Alexev, president of the Union Council, has sat quite alone," end quote. To which Alexev replied, quote, "There can be no doubt that there is no other organization in our country where the principles of democracy are flagrantly abandoned more than in the unions. The most blatant violations are considered normal, ... As a general rule, holders of union offices have been appointed from above," end quote. Alexev. Some days later, Shvernik condemned in his turn, quote, "the forgetting of the rights and needs of union members," end quote, and added, quote, The unions have stopped caring about the workers' protection and security, ... Union activity among the masses in a state of complete decay, end quote. Zvernik, who I think it was said earlier that he replaced Tomsky. All these statements convey the disarray of the political and union cadres in a situation where the union organizations were unable to fulfill, lacking both credibility and listeners, the role that the authorities wished to assign to them. It was in this situation that the signal was given for a new, quote, self-criticism, end quote, campaign. Zvernik set the example at the meeting of the plenum of the Central Council of April 27, 1937. Footnote. This plenum was the sixth since the 1935 Congress. The fifth had met 2.5 years previously. However, in 1934 it had been decided that the plenum would meet every 2 months. Pravda, September 9, 1934, end bracket. End footnote. The sixth plenum decided that a draft statute should be prepared for the unions and submitted to a seventh plenum not later than July 1st. In fact, the social crisis was too deep for this decision to have any result, even in a formal sense. A new plenum met only in September 1938, and no statute was submitted to it. Footnote. These extracts from Zvernik's speech may be found in Schwartz. And footnote. Footnote. This statute was elaborated only in April 1946. This statute would be ratified by the 10th Trade Union Congress. Excuse me, I said that wrong. This statute was elaborated only in April 1949. This statute would be ratified by the 10th Trade Union Congress. This statute consecrated the concept of union task that had prevailed since 1930, giving priority to the task of mobilizing the workers for the fulfillment and overfulfillment of the plan, for the increase of labor productivity and the reduction of production costs. The other tasks are only mentioned toward the end. End footnote. The sixth plenum also decided that the unions had to be, quote, democratized, end quote, and that the secret ballot should be introduced for union meetings. In practice, this decision had no more effect than the others. Choices of candidates were made at public meetings, and open vote was adopted for election of lower union officials, as well as for those who served as auxiliaries of the labor inspectorate. Finally, all the backwash created in the name of the, quote, union crisis, unquote, changed nothing. It did not prevent the growth of workers' discontent. To cope with this discontent, the path of repression was increasingly chosen. Thus, from the 18th Party Congress in March 1939, union questions received little attention. Unions were mentioned only in passing alongside other organizations which were asked to contribute to the, quote, development of socialist competition and the Stakhanovite movement, ... and to ensure ... firm discipline and high labor productivity, end quote. Footnote, KPSS, bracket 1945, and bracket volume 3, page 364. End footnote. The actual, quote, nationalization, end quote, of the trade unions facilitated a substantial deterioration in the living and working conditions of the working class, which will be seen when examining the development of the wage system, work norms, and the level of real wages. That's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening. If you're not just listening to these miscellaneously, and if you're listening to them in some kind of order, the next section is titled, which is section 4, is titled Transformation of the Wage and Norm Fixing Principles and Some Effects of this Transformation. Thank you so much for listening.